BG in the house. Hope everyone's doing well. It's just a little bit before 8 o'clock here in the States. I know it's about 1 o'clock at the time of filming at home. So, a few of you guys are probably thinking, you're in the States, what are you doing? Sitting in a hotel room on a Friday night as opposed to being out and about. If I'm completely honest, it was a big one last night. It was a pretty heavy night out last night. And I've done at least a half marathon today walking around the city. So, do you know what? End of the day, I want a night off. I want to recharge the batteries, and then maybe we'll go again tomorrow night. This is going to be a slightly longer video. As you guys know, because I've been away, I haven't been uploading as regularly as I normally do. So there's been a few topics that have gone by that I haven't addressed that I want to do in this video. Going to give a few shout outs first and foremost. Quick shout out to Jet, who ran the podcast in my absence for 2 weeks in a row. I've mentioned this on several videos now, but if you are someone who tunes into the podcast weekly on Wednesday and you have missed your fix of it, please go over to Jet's channel, which is Boxing Discussions, and hit Jet with a subscribe. And you can also check out the 2 podcasts that he has done with the normal podcast team in my absence. I also made a cameo in yesterday's one. Also want to give a big shout out to Hatman, who I assume the vast majority of my subscribers will be subscribed to Hatman. I know he's got a fairly substantial following in terms of YouTube boxing, but Hatman gave me some pretty kind words in his recent video on George Groves versus Jamie Cox, and it may well be that there's people tuning into this and this is your first video that you've watched on my channel as a result of the recommendation that he provided. So yeah, shout out to Jet, shout out to Hatman, appreciate it. Let's get into it. So we want to cover quite a lot in this video. In fact, let me give you a little bit of a run through, because I made a few notes of what I do actually want to cover in this video, and then you can decide if it's of interest to you. The main topic I want to discuss is Eddie Hearn and his lack of ability to get an opponent for Whyte, and the fact that he has tried and failed several times to make that Whyte versus Deontay Wilder fight. So I want to discuss that, so I actually think that's an interesting topic, and I've got some opinions on that. I want to talk Billy Joe Saunders versus David Lemieux. I want to talk Kevin Johnson versus Francisco Pianeta. We're going to be talking Eubank. Going to be talking the Groves versus Cox weigh-in. Going to be talking Tom Little versus Josh Sunderland. And then maybe if I've got some of the energy left, I'm going to give you a bit of a rant about some of my travels in the recent week. But I'm sure by that point, unless you're a proper hardcore BG maniac, you'll have signed off. But let's start with Eddie Hearn. And let's start with this Hearn-Deontay Wilder thing, about how Hearn has made several multi-million offers to Deontay Wilder to take the fight with Whyte, and Wilder has not taken the fight. Now, long-time viewers, and I appreciate we've had a lot of new people jump on recently, but to set the scene, long-time viewers will know that I have not always been sold on Deontay Wilder, and that I've been fairly critical of his opponent choice, the way his career has been managed, and actually been critical of some of the things that he does in the ring, technically. However, I like to think I'm fair, and I've actually had some stick recently for being very defensive over Deontay Wilder for some of the unfair criticism he's had, in my opinion, given that the Povetkin and Ortiz fights didn't happen. You know, I think that he is blameless in those situations because of the fact that the opponents had performance-enhancing drug controversies in the lead-up to the fight. Whereas certain people think it's all a conspiracy and, you know, etc. Anyway, so I'm kind of setting the scene there that, you know, traditionally haven't been Wilder's biggest advocate. More recently have sort of sprung to his defence a bit. Eddie Hearn, on the other hand, he's a guy who I am a fan of. I am not one of these boxing YouTubers who likes to slag off Eddie Hearn because he's the main man at the minute, because he's the number one, because he's doing pay-per-views. I think Eddie Hearn's actually doing a lot of good for the sport of boxing, although I have actually been critical of him, not critical, but I have actually disagreed with some of the comments he's made about Jamie Cox's chances of beating George Groves in the lead up to that fight. Now, to set the scene, we've had several recent incidents where Hearn has made very well publicised offers to Deontay Wilder to fight Dillian Whyte. So some of the numbers I've seen floating around: $3 million, $3.5 million. I've heard talk of $4 million with US pay-per-view rights in addition. And when Hearn is making these offers, he does have a tendency to be somewhat vocal about the numbers involved. Who can forget, of course, when he put together Frampton versus Scott Quigg, and he did that thing on Sky with the big check, and I think it was £1.5 million, so about $2 million US for, Carl Frampton, who was at the time, I believe, a super bantamweight, to face Scott Quigg. So my point is that our man Eddie Hearn, he's not someone who's reticent about discussing money. He's not someone who's afraid of being bold when it comes down to throwing out big seven-figure sums and for publicising it. And potentially he's viewed that as a good way of making fights. If Deontay Wilder doesn't fight Dillian Whyte and the fans know that there was $4 million on the table, then there may be a perception Deontay is docking Dillian Whyte. Perhaps it's also a way of building his own brand. Perhaps when fighters saw that Eddie Hearn was able to offer a super bantamweight £1.5 million, $2 million US, they thought, oh, Eddie Hearn's the man I want to sign with. So I understand that there's a method to his madness. But I also think there is a risk when you start being that vocal about money. That you set expectations up here when the delivery is here. Let me give you an example. Let's say you get an annual pay rise at work. And let's say your usual pay rise was £1,000 an annum. Let's just pick £1,000 because it's easy mathematics. And let's say you've had a good year and you're really hopeful you're going to get £1,000 added to your basic salary at the end of the year. Then let's say your colleague, your friend, who you talk about these things with, comes out of his annual pay rise meeting and announces that he has had a £5,000 pay rise. Suddenly, that £1,000 that you really wanted and that you really hoped for would actually be a disappointment to receive, wouldn't it? Especially if you believed that you were better than that colleague, that you'd performed better, that you'd worked harder, that you'd achieved more. My point is when expectations are this high, even if the delivery is actually here, you're going to be disappointed. It's a long-winded way of saying Eddie Hearn's offering Deontay Wilder $3 or $4 million. That's a lot of money. That would be the most money Deontay Wilder's earned in his career to date. But doesn't Deontay Wilder actually have a right to believe that he deserves more than that, based on previous figures that Eddie Hearn has put out there? I, for example, have pretty strong recollections of hearing the figure of $5 million that was offered to Charles Martin to fight Anthony Joshua. Now, I appreciate at the time Charles Martin was a world champion, but so is Deontay Wilder. And Deontay Wilder is a far more recognised, far more highly regarded, far more marketable fighter than Charles Martin ever was. I also appreciate that Charles Martin got that money to fight Anthony Joshua rather than Dillian Whyte. But let's not forget that that was prior to Anthony Joshua becoming a champion. That was prior to the Klitschko fight. That was prior to Joshua having quite the same level of superstardom that he's enjoying now. So here you've got Deontay Wilder. You're seeing someone who he would probably view as a lesser fighter than himself in Charles Martin, being offered $5 million plus to leave the US and to defend his belt in the UK. Surely Deontay Wilder is going to have in the back of his mind that he wants more than Charles Martin. Or perhaps, if he acknowledges that Dillian Whyte is a lesser name, perhaps Deontay Wilder would take the same. But I think Deontay Wilder does have in mind the amount of money currently out there in the UK pay-per-view market. I mean, we've seen figures recently, haven't we, that Kubrat Pulev will get a $5 million purse to face Anthony Joshua. Joshua will collect $20 million. I mean, Wilder must be seeing these numbers and thinking to himself that he, Deontay Wilder, is the WBC World Champion. Why should he come over to the UK and fight for less than Charles Martin? Why should he come over to the UK and fight for less than Deontay Wilder? Why should he come into the UK and fight for 4 or 5 times less than Vladimir Klitschko, who was coming off a defeat for? My point is that Hearn has been so vocal about the amount of money in British boxing and the amount of money associated with Anthony Joshua and heavyweight boxing and pay-per-view boxing that perhaps he's got himself to blame when fighters are looking at $3 million offers and saying, no, I can do better than that. You know, Eddie Hearn said, and I saw him say it, $3 million? That's far more than Deontay Wilder's earned in his career today. How much do you think he got against Hearn? Now, a year or so ago, I may have agreed with that analysis. You know. But then Golovkin-Canelo happened. I was probably one of those people thinking, Golovkin should accept a $10 million offer from Canelo. You know, Golovkin hasn't made that much money in his career to date. But then when you actually do the maths, you work out Golovkin was right to hold out. You know, that fight did 2 million pay-per-view buys. Now, those pay-per-view buys were substantially more expensive than the UK pay-per-view buys. They were $60, $70 a bounce. Sold a lot of tickets. You know, 2 million pay-per-view buys. It doesn't take a genius to work out the maths there. Let's say the average price of the pay-per-view was $70. Let's go with it that way. If we say that they did 2 million pay-per-view buys at $70, I mean, let's just work that out off the top of our heads. That's, is that 140 million? Yeah, it is. It's $140 million. Let's say ticket revenue was in addition. Let's say sponsorship revenue was in addition. Now, I appreciate everyone takes some of the money out of that. You know, I appreciate the promoter gets his cut, the managers get his cut, the cornermen get their cut, the TV companies get their cut, the stadium get their cut. What I'm getting at is Triple G was right in that instance to wait out. $10 million seemed like a lot of money, but actually it was comparatively small compared to what he got for waiting out, one would presume. Deontay Wilder's probably in a similar position. You know, Deontay Wilder probably hasn't earned $3 million from a fight before, or $4 million from a fight before. But at the same time, I bet Deontay Wilder's financially comfortable. You know, Deontay Wilder's not worrying about where his next meal's coming from. He's not worried about buying his next car, let's put it that way. Wilder's a comfortable guy. He doesn't need to fight for money tomorrow. He might need to fight for money in a year's time, but there's no rush, you know. So when he sees these numbers flying around, and Kubrat Pulev getting $5 million, and I understand why Kubrat Pulev will have got $5 million. You know, he is the mandatory challenger. If they didn't come to an arrangement, it would have had to have gone to purse bids. Eddie Hearn would have wanted to avoid that. Eddie Hearn would have wanted to avoid Frank Warren bidding on a Joshua purse bid or something like that. So they've had to give Pulev a decent purse because Pulev, you know, was the mandatory and was in that position. But at the same time, you know, once again, it's showing that the UK pay-per-view market and the UK ticket sale market is so buoyant that it can support a guy like Kubrat Pulev getting $5 million as the purse. You know, I read about this in a newspaper, in a British newspaper. You know, this wasn't some sort of internet rumour. So, what I'm getting at is, yes, Hearn's been very, very vocal about how much money is involved in British boxing. Yes, that's done a good job of bringing hype to the British boxing scene, and it's probably done some good for his business. But what that means is fighters are expecting big money now. And guys like Deontay Wilder, the WBC heavyweight champion of the world, are going to justifiably expect that big money to come here to the UK on enemy territory, especially with some of the judging we've had recently, let's be honest, and to put up their belts on a UK pay-per-view show. So, for me, it's no surprise that Deontay Wilder has rejected that. And if I was Deontay Wilder, if I had loads of money in the bank already, would my ego allow me to be the champion, travelling away from home, fighting in front of a hostile crowd, fighting in front of a hostile judges, for less money than Kubrat Pulev? For less money than Charles Martin? I don't know. So has Eddie Hearn created a rod for his own back? And the reason I raised this is Dominic Breazeale's made comments today that Eddie Hearn tried to get Breazeale as an opponent for Dillian Whyte. Obviously as a late notice opponent. Now Dillian still doesn't have a fight for that undercard, but that the offer was lowballed, and that as a result Dominic Breazeale isn't taking the fight. He's actually chosen to fight Eric Molina over Dillian Whyte because he was so dissatisfied with the offer from Eddie Hearn. So, is that another case? You know, Dominic Breazeale, I appreciate he's fought Joshua. I appreciate he's had the odd payday in his career. I don't have any perspective of how much he would have got for that Joshua fight, but presumably it would have been well into the six figures. But no, he's not interested in fighting Dillian Whyte. Yet again, his expectations were up here, and the offer was presumably down here, or else he'd have taken the fight. So it's interesting. And I think there is a big case here that Hearn has created a rod for his own back by being so vocal about money and so loud and proud about the amount of business that these guys are doing in the UK on pay-per-view buys and that sort of thing. That's just my perspective on it. That's just my perspective on it. And I'm not saying Eddie Hearn was necessarily wrong to do that, but I'm saying it's an inevitable consequence. And this is potentially why these kind of fights aren't happening. Because when a heavyweight like a Robert Helenius or a Lucas Brown or a Dominic Breazeale is getting a phone call from Eddie Hearn, and the phone call's going something like, I'd like to make you an offer to fight Dillian Whyte on an Anthony Joshua pay-per-view. At that point, they're thinking, it's Christmas time, I'm buying a new Range Rover, I'm buying a new Rolex. That's potentially what they're thinking at that point. But in actuality, it appears, that the numbers that Charles Martin got, that the numbers that Kubrat Pulev are going to get, maybe are only associated with, with Anthony Joshua. I think that will create some interesting negotiations for Eddie Hearn, let's put it that way, in the upcoming years. Where does that leave us? Dominic Breazeale versus Eric Molina. Breazeale for me, fresher guy, more interesting guy. Molina, he's half decent, but you'd expect Breazeale to come through in that one. He's the guy you would guess has more to offer out of the two. Dillian Whyte, I've seen Hearn suggest in some interviews that he's got an opponent lined up. Well, if he has, let's not keep it a secret for too much longer. I mean, fight date is getting close. Is Dillian Whyte supposed to be fighting on the AJ undercard? Because my computer's telling me it's the 14th of October. And if I recollect, the AJ undercard is the 28th of October. So yeah, we if that is still the attention that Dillian Whyte has, is going to be fighting in 2 weeks' time today, which I believe it is. They're talking a real late notice opponent, and if Eddie Hearn does have this mythical top 15 opponent, we need to hear about it pretty quickly, because I suspect it's going to be a taxi driver if it goes on for 2 months longer, especially if the money being offered is not good. Because let me tell you, if I would want a certain amount of money to fight Dillian Whyte, I'd want a lot more than that certain amount of money to fight him on less than 2 weeks' notice. You want a premium as a fighter to take a fight like that on short notice. So where it leaves Dillian Whyte is not good. Yeah, I've seen Dillian Whyte interview a few times where he's talked about money. Whyte believes that he's like a... I don't want to be down on Dillian Whyte, but he certainly is quite clear about the fact he wants to get paid and he expects big money and he sees himself taking pay-per-view fights, etc. And I can see why. He's a marketable guy. He, with his conduct and with the way he sells fights, has made big money for Eddie Hearn with the first Joshua fight, with the Derek Chisora fight, etc. But Dillian Whyte is not one of these guys. I'm not aware of a huge section of Dillian Whyte fans. If Tyson Fury comes back to the ring, there'll be people wanting to buy tickets to see him fight. If Joshua's fighting, there's people wanting to buy tickets to see him fight. I don't get people contacting me about Dillian Whyte fights so regularly. I mean, he's a name. People like watching his interviews. But do people actually buy Dillian Whyte tickets? Are people sitting at home rubbing their hands with glee at the next Dillian Whyte pay-per-view? I think his name is still some way off that sort of level. And yeah, I think with the heavyweight division as it is at present, it's going to be continuously hard for Eddie Hearn to match up Dillian Whyte. But anyway, that's just my perspective. Let's see what happens. What we're left with is Breazeale Molina. We're left with Wallace de Verme, and we're left with Dillian Whyte versus your favourite fighter, TBA. Moving on, let's talk another quick heavyweight match. I was surprised to see that Kevin Johnson is fighting Francisco Pianeta tomorrow. Two guys who, at their best, were decent fighters. Neither exceptional. Neither would you have in your top 5 or probably your top 10 in the division. But these are both guys who would have been on the periphery, certainly of the top 25, top 30 at their peaks. They're squaring off against each other in Germany. Both of them have had high-profile losses recently. I think Pianeta has had 3 comeback knockout wins since he lost to Ruslan Chagayev. I think Kevin Johnson's had 1 comeback win since his last loss to Pulev. And yeah, they're going to square off. For what it's worth, in a fight that has limited interest, I suspect Pianeta will prove victorious. I get the impression that at this stage Kevin Johnson really is taking the journeyman type route, I'm afraid. And when we saw him fight Tyson Fury or maybe even Derek Chisora, at that point you'd have maybe described Kevin Johnson as a very high level gatekeeper. At this point you're kind of describing him as an upper level journeyman. Some of the beatings he's taken, he's proven to be nothing more than a punch bag. A guy like Pianeta, funnily enough, on his day you could probably pick Kevin Johnson to beat Pianeta. But I just get the impression, Pianeta's had 3 knockout wins since his last loss to Chagayev. He probably wants one more shot at a big fight. Kevin Johnson, he talks a good game, but it's a sad demise to his career, and it's probably going to be another beating that he suffers here. One of the sad things about Kevin Johnson is he's so durable that, I know he got stopped by AJ in 2 rounds, I think, but he's generally so durable is that you do worry about him. Because he probably will go the distance against a guy like Pianeta. He went the distance against Kubrat Pulev, let's put it that way. So in a way, a sad fight. I guess the winner of this fight, whoever it is, will have some sort of claim to being back in the mix. Let's assume Pianeta wins the fight. You could probably say on the peripheries of the top 25. You could probably say not a million miles off entering that European title mix, I guess. So for you heavyweight boxing fans, potentially one to keep your eyes on. And we'll stick with the heavyweights before we move on to some other weight divisions. I'll also give a shout out to a really good fight, and I know my man Mikey is keen for this fight, but Tom Little versus Josh Sandland this Saturday. Believe it's at York Hall, although it may very easily not be. So please do check BoxRec, check the promoters' websites and details, etc. before you buy your tickets on my recommendations. You'd kind of describe this as a below English level fight at this point. You know, these are two guys who are talented fighters who have not proven it on the big stage just yet, but you would certainly say that the winner of this fight is very much in the mix for English title level and could potentially throw themselves into that British title mix. So I think it's a relevant fight because, as you guys know, there's some really, really interesting fighters at the minute in the lower levels of the British heavyweight division. Guys like Dubois, Gorman, David Price, you know, those sort of names. The winner of this fight could certainly get a fight against one of those sort of names, and it could make for an interesting matchup. Josh Sandland, if you haven't heard of him, is someone who I've seen box before, and he's actually a really interesting fighter. He's only fought twice. He's 2-0. He's not much to look at. He doesn't have the greatest physique. He looks quite overweight. But both times he's fought, he's gone in and he scored a major upset. The first fight against Joan Volu, who was 4-0, but more importantly, at York Hall against Dominic Akinlade. And at the time, Akinlade, if I recall, was Southern Area title, scheduled to fight for the English against Josh Sandland. Sandland went in there with only one scheduled to fight for the English. Akinlade was scheduled to fight for the English against Nathan Gorman. But Josh Sandland went in there as a huge underdog, having only had one previous professional fight and pretty much won every round against Dominic Akinlade, you know, very much as the away fighter. So he's an interesting fighter, Sandland. You know, he's very young, very inexperienced, but he's got two big upset wins with no experience, and this is a winnable fight for him. Let's not forget, Tom Little lost to Dominic Akinlade, who's a guy Sandland's already beaten. So for me, this is a 50-50 fight because I do like Tom Little. Tom Little, on his day, is a decent fighter. It's kind of last chance saloon for him, I guess. He's unfortunately had a few losses in his career, most notably for the Southern Area title against Dominic Akinlade. Lost to Dorian Darts early on in his career. But on his day, he's decent. And when I saw him fight Tom Dallas earlier on this year, he looked like an improved fighter. He looked like he was in better shape. He was putting punches together nicely. He's quite smooth, quite slick in there, throws combinations fairly well. And he's certainly got a big experience advantage. He's 9 wins, 4 losses. BoxRec have him as the 13th best fighter in the UK at heavyweight. So let's see who wins this fight. Little versus Sandland, a real 50-50 in my opinion. I actually think the winner of this fight could go on to getting a notable fight. Now, you know, it may be a fight against a guy like a Daniel Dubois where they go in as a heavy underdog, but this is a decent scrap if you're into the domestic heavyweight scene. So I just thought I'd mention that in case people weren't aware. Let's talk about some of the other divisions. I got a lot of comments after my video the other day on Eubank versus Yildirim. And the truth of the matter is, let me be frank. I am never someone who I try not to be someone who believes it's my way or the highway. I acknowledge that I often get things wrong. It's not even irregular for me to get things wrong. Let me tell you, I've done a complete U-turn on Chris Eubank Jr. When I saw him lose to Billy Joe Saunders, my take was that Billy Joe beat him for the first half of the fight. Billy Joe completely gassed and still had enough to get the job done. So my take was that if Eubank fought someone with a similar skill level to Billy Joe Saunders, but someone who was in shape and didn't gas, it would be quite easy for Eubank to lose every single round. That was my take. People at the time were telling me Eubank was very, very good, and I disagreed with them. I thought Eubank was probably a European level fighter. Now, it may be that at the time he actually was only a European level fighter, but the guy has improved. The guy has improved exponentially. You know, he went into that Saunders fight not really having had a great depth of experience. You know, I've said this so many times on my channel. Look back on his resume and ask yourself, who was the best guy Chris Eubank Jr. had beaten going into that Billy Joe Saunders fight? And the answer is nobody. He'd beaten nothing going into that fight. So he was hugely inexperienced, and I think that cost him severely. He actually got the experience he needed after that fight. He got that British level experience, the Spike O'Sullivans, the Nick Blackwells. He got that Euro experience, the Chudinovs, the Abrahams. He's got that more recently, and he's coming into his prime, and he looks devastating. I've done a complete U-turn on Chris Eubank Jr. The doubt for me with Eubank Jr. is facing the moving boxer. All of his opponents since the loss to Billy Joe Saunders have been flat-footed, plodders. They've been guys who've been easy to find. They've been guys who aren't giving a lot of angles, not giving a lot of movement, not giving a lot of defence. I guess that's kind of still my concern about Chris Eubank Jr. You know, even if you look back at his fight against Tom Doran, and he destroyed Tom Doran, don't get me wrong, but even if you look back on that fight, the times where Eubank stands off and boxes from range against Doran actually has levels of success. So that is my concern, and that's a big concern going into a fight with George Groves, because Groves, best jab in British boxing, long range fighter, sniper from range. So that's a true acid test for Eubank Jr. And you could make a very conceivable case for Groves to beat Eubank Jr. Do not get me wrong. I just think that Groves, with his frailties, may get found out by Eubank Jr. And of course, Groves could lose to Jamie Cox, which means the fight will never happen. But I think Groves will beat Cox. I think this Eubank fight will happen. And I actually think Groves, if he was able to fight like he can for the first half of the fight throughout 12 rounds, I think Groves could well beat Eubank Jr. But I think the frailties in Groves' game are going to be too much against a guy like Chris Eubank Jr. So yeah, complete U-turn on Eubank Jr. He's a very, very good fighter, and let me say I was impressed by I don't know if you guys have seen the extended interview Calais Sauerland did with IFL TV. I always watch a Calais Sauerland interview whenever I see it coming up, and he said, you know, in that interview, if you haven't seen it, I'd recommend you checking it out. It's about 25 minutes long, but it's worth the investment of your time, especially because by now you've invested 33 minutes into watching me. So if you're happy to make that investment, you should be happy to watch Mr. Sauerland for less time. But yeah, so Sauerland talks about the trouble in that arena. He talks about the gangs who are present. He talks about the signs saying welcome to hell. He talks about himself being actually quite nervous and scared. And then he sees Chris Eubank Jr. just walking to the ring in a Union Jack, just not bothered in the slightest. You know, I got to say, I've come round to Eubank. I've done a total 360. I've come round to him as a fighter. I've come round to him as a personality. I like the way he holds himself. He actually impresses me, the way he holds himself. You know, he's got a swagger about him, but he's got a coolness, a calmness about him, and it's impressive. There's a steel to him, you know, there's a real steel to him, and you know, I think that will help him a long way when he gets into the big fights. Speaking of Chris Eubank Jr., we've already mentioned the name Billy Joe Saunders, which I guess is inevitable in any video or any conversation that discusses Chris Eubank Jr. As you guys will know, Billy Joe Saunders been ordered to fight David Lemieux, which I believe is a fight that will take place in December, ideally. Now, I'll be fascinated to see if this fight actually gets made, and I'm sceptical it will, because, you know, Billy Joe Saunders he's got a following, but he's the kind of guy who, he's more selling out or half selling out a copper box rather than an O2 or a Wembley Arena. And David Lemieux's had big fights in his career. He's a big name. He's quite a well-regarded fighter globally. So I wonder if they're going to have the money to bring over David Lemieux to fight in like a copper box. I just wonder if Lemieux's going to be after 7 figures. Maybe Lemieux's been hearing about all the money in British boxing and British broadcasters and ticket sales and pay-per-view buys, and maybe he's going to be wanting $1 million or $2 million to come over for this fight. I don't know. But Billy Joe Saunders, David Lemieux, well, my guess is that's not a pay-per-view fight. I don't see Frank sticking that on Box Nation pay-per-view. At least I hope he doesn't. The problem is that without the Sky promotion, I don't know. I don't even know if it sells out the copper box. And I'm going to be honest, I'm a huge Billy Joe Saunders fan. But yet again, at his most recent fight, there was significant trouble in the crowd. And, I've been to a few Billy Joe Saunders fights, and he is one of these fighters who, some of his following, he's got some fairly scary people in his following, let's put it that way. And I wonder if that will actually begin to affect his ticket sales, because I've got subscribers on my own channel who have messaged me live from the Billy Joe Saunders fight, saying that they're, in the arena, they've taken their children to watch the fight, and some of the stuff going on in the crowd is less than savoury. So, perhaps the fact that that's happened on several occasions now with Billy Joe Saunders fights are actually going to mean tickets are even harder to sell next time out. I don't know. I'm speculating on something I have no knowledge on. But it's certainly an open question. So I'm sceptical. Will Lemieux come over? Will there be an offer to bring over a guy like David Lemieux? Because I suspect he's going to want a 7-figure offer. And, as I say, I don't see that fight doing the O2. Not at all. So, interesting one. If it does happen, and Billy Joe Saunders wins, then Billy Joe Saunders needs some serious credit, because Saunders is still a young fighter. And if he closes out 2017 with Andy Lee, David Lemieux, and Chris Eubank Jr. on his resume, you've actually got to say he's got a fairly strong list of opponents. Let's not forget he took the unbeaten records of Spike O'Sullivan, of Nick Blackwell, of John Ryder, of Emmanuel Blandamura. Let's not forget he took all of these guys' unbeaten records. Let's not forget he just beat Willie Monroe Jr. If he ends the year with Andy Lee's, with the belt he took from Andy Lee, having defended it against David Lemieux, and having taken Chris Eubank Jr.'s own, you got to say Billy Joe Saunders has a fairly strong resume in the context of British boxing. In fact, people see that as a good fight. I'm sure a lot of Americans and Canadian fans think that David Lemieux would knock out Billy Joe Saunders. I actually think Billy Joe Saunders would bring up a bit of a decent skill advantage in that fight. You guys know I'm a big Saunders fan. I think Saunders is very underrated technically. I think some of the subtleties in Billy Joe Saunders' game are pretty advanced and could be missed unless you were looking out for them. But I think he's a very, very hard man to beat when he's on song. And I do actually suspect that he probably does have the beating of David Lemieux, at least from a technical standpoint. Lemieux, clearly he's a big puncher. He's a big guy at middleweight. You wouldn't necessarily want to rule David Lemieux out of any fight. He probably is still a top 5 middleweight. I think he's coming off a chilling knockout of Curtis Stevens, if I'm not mistaken. And Saunders is going to have to be very wary of that power. But for me, I do view Lemieux as beatable. We saw how easily controlled he was by Gennady Golovkin from a technical standpoint. We've seen him take losses earlier on in his career, and I just think Billy Joe Saunders is going to have too much skill-wise and could frustrate him, could make him miss, could out-jab him, could out-maneuver him. But it's an interesting fight, and it's a fight that would, at least for me, create huge intrigue if it is actually made. I'm sceptical it will be. So remember, I'm saying that. You heard it here first. I'd be very interested to see what terms are made for this fight if that information becomes available. But let's see. George Groves versus Jamie Cox tomorrow night. Sort of weigh-in today. No surprises from the weigh-in. Cox weighed in a little bit heavier than Groves, but both of them were towards the top of the limit. Groves, as you know, always looks tight at the weight. He's a very, very big man. He's got a big frame, just height. He's just a big guy, George Groves. You know, I know he's weighed in at 12 stone. I'm sure Groves is over 13 stone on fight night, and I'm sure he's not someone who tends to blow up in massive shape, but I'm sure he's high 13, low 14 stones when he's not in training camp. Let's put it that way. He's got a big frame. Cox looked very comfortable at the weight. There's clearly more to come off Cox. You know, the difference between middleweight and super middleweight is 8 pounds. That is substantial. So I don't know how easy it would be. He's 31 now to start cutting that weight again, but Cox is clearly the smaller man in this fight. It's no surprise. We've known that for some time now. So, yeah, I guess sort of weigh in today. Both guys look ready to roll. Did I learn anything from it that's influenced my prediction? Possibly not. Prediction video for that up on the channel. Went up yesterday or the day before, so please do give that a look if it's of interest. Guys, I've rambled on for more than long enough. We've covered a lot of topics in this video. 41 minutes long and counting. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up. If you're new or you haven't done so before, please subscribe. You want to support the channel, give us a follow on Twitter at Boxing Gossip. You can add me as a friend on Facebook. There's a link in the description box below. And thank you very much to everyone who's invested 41.5 minutes of their life in listening to me ramble on about the sport we all love. Thanks for tuning in, guys.